Oh, wow, there we go. That's right. It's amazing. You can use a microphone every week and still be surprised when it pops on. And sometimes it's at exactly the right spot to pick up way more volume than it needs to. There we go. It's like right here in front of my mouth. Tonight we're going to cover a significant chunk of the end of the book of Genesis, and next week we will conclude the study of the specific chapters, and I think that leaves us with 2 Wednesday nights after to kind of do a bit of a wrap-up, tie a bow on everything, I think, if I'm doing my math correctly. And if not, then we'll only have one, and I'll be rushed and feel like I didn't accomplish everything I wanted to, and that's okay. Ironically, study over the course of Genesis for 6 months and still feel rushed, right? So we're covering, as I said, a significant chunk of the text. We're going to start in chapter 45, and we're not going to read everything tonight. There's a lot in here that is, obviously it's the Bible. I'm going to affirm that the whole thing is valuable, beneficial, good for teaching, and I don't want to diminish any one particular part of Scripture, but some of it is less essential for our understanding of the book as a whole than other parts of it are for this evening's discussion. And so starting in chapter 45, verse 25, it says, "So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob, and they told him, 'Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt.' And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them." Now, I want to point something out here. I've read this before, and the quick shift from there, his heart was numb because he did not believe them, to the next verse. "But when they told him all of the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived." So I'm not surprised that Jacob doesn't believe his sons, given the history of these men as they've been portrayed in the book of Genesis up to this point. Obviously, we, as people who are in on the story of the sale of Joseph, we have no reason to believe them other than the fact that we are also in on the story of Joseph in Egypt. We can distrust them, and we can understand why Jacob would distrust them. But he quickly shifts, right, the mounting evidence. And I'll say this, Jacob is not stubborn about his ability to change his mind and observe the information at hand. And Israel said, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." I think that that's a good conclusion, really, to this particular chapter. I think that there's, so much crammed in here about the reunion of the brothers, Joseph's, revelation of who he is, all the backstory that's given. And then what ends up happening in chapter 46 is we're given a genealogy. And instead of going too deep into the genealogy, we're going to read this very beginning part here. It says, "So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, 'Jacob, Jacob.' And he said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes.'" And so it gives us then the story of the travel from Beersheba to Egypt, and also, again, the genealogy, or rather, the accounting of the sons of Jacob. And it enumerates them, and it ties in who their sons are, and really, without getting too into it, we can just kind of skip down to verse 26 and 27. It says, "All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. Okay, so we're being given this big number here, and something I'm going to remind you of. These are the relations of Jacob that go into Egypt, but they would have brought along servants as well. There are additional individuals that would be numbered in this group beyond the 70 that we're told about here. Sometimes we forget. Abraham had a large following of people. Isaac had a large following of people. Sorry. I drank a milkshake about 20 minutes ago, and it's messing with my throat. Don't drink a milkshake right before you teach a class. This is a substantial-sized family to move into another country in the first place, but when you consider all the household logistics that are required to move not just your own family, but the entire support system that your family has, the herds, the hired hands, the people that are a part of your household but not your relatives, it's a big undertaking, which means Jacob has a tremendous amount of confidence in what he's going to. And that's when we see that God tells him at the beginning, I am God, the God of your father Abraham and Isaac, right? Jacob has confidence in God at this point. Lavera. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And up to the point previously where Jacob has returned to the promised land, to Canaan, right? There was a little bit of I'm going to barter with God on things. I don't know if I necessarily trust him, but if he does what I'm asking him to do, then he'll be my God. He returns to Canaan, and we've seen this transition in him where he trusts God. Now, God has given him plenty of reason. They literally had a wrestling match about the whole situation. But here, hearing God say, I will be with you. First of all, God is speaking Jacob's language because that's what God was asked by Jacob. If you will be with me in my travels, then you will be my God. Well, now God is saying, I am God, the God of your father. I will be with you. And Jacob trusts in that. And this is a different man, again, than we met at the beginning of the story. As we continue on, in verse 28, it says, he had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. It's very different words than he used. It sounds really similar. I want to be clear. It sounds really similar to the words that he uses when he thinks he's lost Joseph. He says, I'm overcome with sorrow. I may as well be in Sheol, right? The depths. I should be buried down in the pit. Here, though, he says, now let me die. And this is not like gallows language. He's not wishing for his death. He's saying, like, now I would be at peace in doing this. It would not be a torturous death for me. I'm not going into the grave sorrowful or torn apart the way that you were torn apart in my imagination. Instead, he's accepting with peace. This is what I've wanted, to know that my son was still alive. Joseph said to his brothers, this is verse 31 through 34, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me, and the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. I always kind of wanted to know what exactly was meant. Why did the Egyptians despise shepherds? We know that it can't be because they were vegetarians, because they weren't vegetarians. They ate meat. They didn't eat all meat, but they definitely ate meat. They worshipped cows, so I thought maybe it was like a rival thing between cows and sheep, right? Two different types of herds or flocks that you could potentially have. And that doesn't seem to be the case either, because we do have depictions of Egyptian shepherds, specifically in hieroglyphic form. We have depictions of shepherds who were Egyptian, but they were the outskirts of society. If you remember, we talked about how for the Egyptians, the idea of a shaved face, shaved head, shaved body was a hygienic sort of thing. All these depictions of Pharaoh where he's bald, it was a wonderful thing. If you were a bald man naturally, that was a great thing, because you didn't have all of the issues with the nasty stuff that would get stuck in your hair, and you didn't have to wash quite the same way as other people. Bald was beautiful. Patrick Stewart would have made a great Pharaoh. He did play Pharaoh in what was it? The Prince of Egypt. He was the voice of the Pharaoh. Yeah. Sorry, a little tangent there. So Patrick Stewart would have fit right in with the aristocracy, with that bald head, right? Perfect, because you didn't have the uncleanness of hair. There's speculation that lice had been a pretty big problem in Egypt at one point, and they realized if you don't have hair, the lice don't want to nest on you. And so, they took this really seriously. Well, that was also a very metropolitan thing. If you lived in the cities, you were very aware of hygiene. You took it far more seriously than the country bumpkins, right? Those shepherds out there don't know a thing about hygiene. They're out there, they've got these beards, these thick, gnarly beards, and they're like among the sheep, and they're like picking the sheep up, and their beards are touching the sheep, and you don't know what bugs and stuff are getting in their beards. And so I did a lot of reading this last week about Egyptians and shepherds, and they were okay with shepherds existing as long as they existed over there. We want to buy the sheep from them, but we don't want to be the ones responsible for skinning the sheep or the slaughter of the sheep. In fact, one of the things that is significant in the Passover feast is that the Israelite people did their own butchering. It's a very unusual thing in Egyptian culture to be associated with death, to touch dead things. And generally, we stereotype the ancient world as very comfortable with dead things and always being around stuff that was dead or dying. And we have a lot of evidence that most cultures were not as serious about this as the Egyptians. But the Egyptians, one of the reasons that they perfected mummification was that they wanted you to be as undead as you possibly could be when you were dead. They didn't want you to rot. They didn't want you to stink. They didn't want you to smell. And so the embalming, the removal of the organs, the wrapping with cloth, all of these were things that they did to distance themselves from the even, visibility of death. Well, shepherds dealt with death all the time. They were responsible for slaughtering the animals to sell in the meat markets. But when an Egyptian bought meat, they didn't have to see the animal die. They didn't have to handle blood. They didn't have to handle the fur or the cloth or anything like that. This is actually one of the reasons that leather was not overly commonly used in the Egyptian world, because it was dead stuff. We don't want dead stuff on us. And so textiles became a really big thing in Egypt, specifically because they wanted a form of cloth, fabric, material that they could dress themselves in that had no association with death. They were a hyper-hygienic and death-averse culture. Both of those things are really difficult when you're a shepherd. You deal with death and mess on a regular basis. And so it's very convenient that what Joseph tells them is, you really play up just how important this whole shepherding thing is to you, because they're not going to want to have anything to do with you. But we're also going to see that all of this plays into what Joseph is about to do to everyone else. Everyone else in the world is coming to Egypt, and Joseph has a plan for how that's going to play out. So his brothers and his father do exactly as they were told to. They tell Pharaoh they're given the land of Goshen, or rather, they're allowed to stay there, and Pharaoh's like, yeah, you stay up there. I don't need interaction with you. I trust that if Joseph vouches for you, that's good enough for me. You keep your smelly sheep and your bloody hands up there. That's the thought process here. In chapter 47, it says, now there was no food in the land. This is, I think, the fourth time that the book has told us this. For the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. So we knew Canaan was suffering, right? But now we're being told that it's in a perilous state, that languished word. It's late in the famine. And so any hope that this is over is kind of gone in a lot of people's minds. It says, and Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house, and when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. And Joseph answered, give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. Sorry. So we see this progression. So first of all, it's the money, and now it's the livestock. And the next part is perhaps the most significant. It says, so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, and the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we, with our land, will be servants to Pharaoh. Historically, we know that there was a period of time that all of the land in Egypt was owned by individuals, that individual property was an actual thing. But for the vast majority of history, Pharaoh was the owner of the land, and everyone just paid him tribute. And for a long period of time, we didn't have evidence that there was ever individual property ownership in Egypt. But only recently have we seen like bills of sale for property around the time of what's called the Hyksos, which are a Semitic group that took up residence within the land of Egypt. Actually ended up becoming like the major foes in the eyes of the Egyptians, these Semitic individuals who were shepherds, who took up residence in their land and caused them no end of trouble. Now, we don't think that the Hyksos or the Hyksos were the Israelites. We think that they were probably a separate group of individuals that happened to share some similar traits that had at one point migrated into Egypt. That said, it would explain in a lot of ways why the Egyptians were distrustful of Hebrews in general. If the Hyksos were there before Joseph had arrived, there's already a stereotypical image of what these people are like. Oh, they're going to come take our land. They're going to have a whole bunch of sheep. They're going to smell. They're going to speak another language. They're not going to participate in our society in any way, shape, or form. Their contributions are going to be minimal. They're going to trade things that are, they're nice, but they're not of great value to us in exchange for the things that we really would like to keep for ourselves, and we'd just like for them to leave. But Joseph has set a different precedent, and so now he has the collateral to be able to set up his family in Goshen. But Joseph has consolidated all of the land in Egypt, and as far as we can tell, he's consolidated all the land in Canaan as well. And it's all under Egyptian rule. Now, up until this point, when you talk about Abimelech up in the land of Canaan, he is a vassal state to the Egyptians. He's his own country, his own king. He has a little town that he rules over. He gets to wear a crown and call himself, the Lord of the nation. He sends tribute down to Egypt for protection on a fairly regular basis. This is a turning point in history because now, although he might still be considered the king by his local kinsmen, he doesn't own the land. Pharaoh owns the land. And he'll get to continue to rule as kind of like a governor, but he's not going to be the king, which explains a lot when we arrive at what the Canaanite people have heard about the works of God in the land of Egypt during the book of Exodus. We tend to think that these places are so geographically far apart, like in our minds, for whatever reason, we have them much further apart than they actually are. And in fact, for this period in history, from here until the Exodus, they're one nation. Now, Pharaoh loses his ability to control Canaan during the book of Exodus. He can't even control his own nation. He doesn't have the resources. His population has been decimated, might not be the right word, but it's close to. People are starving. He's in a far worse state than they've been in. But the truth is, God is setting up a situation under which the communication between Canaan and Egypt is very strong. It's a situation in which these people will know everything that happens in the land of Egypt because that's where their real king lives. And if the real king is unhappy, everyone out there is going to know why they're unhappy. And we have letters written from the people in Canaan during the time of the Exodus in which these nation states up here in Canaan are sending letters back to Pharaoh saying, "We're sorry we've missed our tribute payment. We know that you are financially strapped right now, but we're anticipating war with a group of people that we think you're familiar with." The Canaanites are shuddering at the idea that they're going to have to deal with the people that have just left Egypt. And so this is all setting the stage for that in many ways. This protected state that they live in Goshen, really apart from most of the Egyptian culture, a situation under which they will leave with the whole world knowing the circumstances by which they are leaving, and a Canaan that has been for decades sending tribute to Egypt, but will not receive protection from Egypt because Egypt is now destroyed. That's the whole setup here. When we get to the book of Exodus, it seems so easy. I mean, obviously, we read about the plagues and we're like, that's an awful lot of plagues. That seems like a lot of work to get these people out of there. But if you really think about what transpires, the way in which they leave the country, it's not too difficult to imagine that if they had just done what God wanted, not only could they have left the country, but they could have claimed the promised land all in one fell swoop. But they don't want to play ball, right? That's perhaps one of the biggest problems that the Israelite people face, is that God sets the table for them, and they're a little distrustful. Okay. Genesis 47, verse 19b. Notice it says, "And give us seeds that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." In a couple weeks, we're going to talk about some ties between the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Genesis. But this is a subtle hint that I think we should pick up on, or maybe a not so subtle hint. If you remember, in the beginning of the book of Genesis, we're told that the trees produce fruit and seed, right? And that they are fruitful and they multiply, creating more of their own kind. This is God's intention and purpose. And it moves from an abundant, fruitful garden paradise to a desolate space, right? Now we have both a move from a kind of garden paradise, a time of plenty in the life of Joseph, to a desolate wasteland, back to what is essentially a garden paradise. And Pharaoh is going to employ all the people to take care of the land. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, chapter 1, God tells the people to tend to the garden, to have dominion over the land. He has the land. It's all God's land. But God essentially gives Adam and Eve, the humans, dominion over the land. This is what we're going to see happen as a result of Joseph's stewardship, is that in many ways he sees us through the fertile, plentiful, fruitful garden into the desolate waste, and then back into a fertile, fruitful garden. And he gives them the seed to do it with. And he couldn't do that if, and this is a big picture idea here, if the curse that God had placed on the ground applied to Joseph. Now, I'm not saying that the curse doesn't apply to all of humanity, but I feel as though God is doing something unique in Joseph as a forecast for what will come. That for one individual who is faithful continually, God reverses the curse and gives Joseph success with the tilling of the land and with the employing of other human beings to work the soil. Because we know, historically speaking, based on the timelines we believe are correct, that Egypt is going to see the most prosperous era in their history while the Israelite people are living there. And it's all because of Joseph. But once Joseph is forgotten, things get really bad for the Egyptian people. They get really bad for the Israelites for a short period of time. But this is part of the design pattern of the book of Genesis. It's part of God's design, of course, but part of the narrative of Genesis is that it's supposed to end with some fulfillment of the things that we've been told are going to happen. Now, it's not complete and perfect fulfillment. Not everyone can now work the ground with it yielding to them in ways that are miraculous and like the Garden of Eden. But it's awfully close for Joseph. So leave that there for just a moment. Genesis 47, verse 29 through 31 says, "And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, 'If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burying place,' their burying place, rather. He answered, 'I will do so, do as you have said.' And he said, 'Swear to me.' And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed." If you notice, for Jacob and for Isaac and for Abraham, the question of where you're buried matters. In their mind, it's a significant thing. I don't know if you've put a whole lot of thought into where you're going to be buried, or if you're going to be buried. Maybe you'll be cremated. I don't know. Maybe you're hoping that you'll get to be like James Doohan, Scotty from Star Trek, and they'll, cremate you, and then they put him on a rocket, like a little launch trajectory for the sun. What he wanted was to have his ashes sent to the sun, and because he was Scotty, of course they're going to do that for him, right? I don't know if you've put a lot of thought into where you're going to be buried. The truth is, other than the Egyptians, at this time in history, we're not really sure a lot of people cared all that much about where they were buried. Now we know, the pharaohs put a lot of thought into where they would be buried, how they would be buried. We talked before about the ritual process of like disemboweling them and embalming them and going through the whole process of getting their bodies ready for what they believed was a grand afterlife that they would walk through. I've been watching Moon Knight, which is a Marvel television series that's loosely based on Egyptian mythology. But they've got the whole idea of the field of reeds and a field of sand, right? And the field of reeds is this wonderful, splendid place that we all want to head to, where we get to walk in fields of gold and Sting is singing in the background, right? And on the other hand, you could end up in the field of sand, which is a miserable, accursed place, and that's not where you want to end up being. That's not the Israelite conception of what happens when you die. Their expectation is not, I'm going to die and either be in fields of gold or in the sea of sand. That's not how Israelites thought about the afterlife. To them, there was Sheol, right? Death, a common place that all of humanity would go to. And the book of Genesis doesn't talk a whole lot about anything that comes after that in outright theological terms. But the fact that the patriarchs cared about where they were buried should tell us something, because here's the thing. Rabbinic literature, specifically that of the Pharisaic line, I should tell you, believed that the reason that Jacob would have wanted to be buried in this cave was because when the resurrection happened, he wanted to be there with his fathers, with Isaac and Abraham. Being buried in that cave was a guarantee that they would not lose one another in the resurrection. That's what rabbinic literature says. Now, we don't know if Jacob had a clear image of the resurrection, but he believed that he continued to live after he died, and where he was buried was significant enough to him to make arrangements for it, to go all the way back to Canaan. Again, I think I said geographically it's not that distant, but for the time, it was a pretty significant distance. He wanted to be buried with his fathers in the tomb, the place that they were buried. That was important to him. I think Genesis is giving us a very clear image here that there is an expected resurrection, that there is something that's going to happen after death, and if I can choose where I'm going to be buried and who I'm going to be buried with, I want to have that option. There's even a lament on Jacob's part over not being able to bury Rachel where he wanted to bury her. That's built into the story of the book of Genesis. He would have loved to bury her in the tomb of the ancestors, but he wasn't able to. And so what we see here, I think, if I can be so bold, Jacob believes that that body that he's in, God's got a purpose for it beyond his death. And it's forward-looking to a time where, what's in the tomb, the specific tomb, really does matter. Now, there's a whole bunch of Jewish theology about whether or not you should be cremated as a result and things like that. I don't think that matters a whole lot, because the God that created the universe made it out of nothing, right? And was able to form all the different atoms. Some of the atoms that Dawn's made of are atoms other people were made of at one point in time or another. God can sort all of that out, right? We're not too worried about how God is going to reconstitute Dawn or Chris or Lavera or anybody else in the resurrection. We just know he's going to do it. But that's the key. He's going to do it. And wouldn't it be great, very convenient, if we could be right there with the people we're looking most forward to seeing in the resurrection, right? This is the thinking of the patriarchs. Now, if we should apply that forward to Christian theology, I don't know. But I really do think for Jacob, that's the motivating factor. Why do I want to go back to the promised land? Well, yeah, it would be nice to be buried where God told me all of my ancestors are going to live in the future. But more importantly, that tomb is really significant to my family. That's where everybody is. And if there is hope for an eternal life that involves a resurrection, I want to be right there with them. So, Lavera. That's a good question. What does the NIV say? Let me take a look here and see what the Hebrew says. Israel, so for me it's, then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So bowed is yistahu, bowed himself. And that it could mean a number of things. Here I'm seeing it could mean to lean, to prostrate, to bow. And then you said stack? Staff.
Hebrews says, and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. I was just curious.
Yeah. Let me look here. So the Septuagint says staff, which is the Greek word there. But the Hebrew word is the word for bed. And so it's probably, oftentimes the NIV will do, so in Hebrews, right, it's staff, right? So the writer's understanding in the book of Hebrews is from the Septuagint. There's no question about it. And that's, because he chooses to use the Greek word for staff there, the writer of Hebrews is familiar with the Greek Old Testament. Doesn't mean he's not familiar with the Hebrew. This is the English Standard Version, and it uses the Hebrew text here. So I would say for the harmonization with the book of Hebrews, it's definitely appropriate to utilize the Septuagint here. But the original manuscripts would have said bed instead of staff. But both would be the head of, or the top of the staff or bed. And so the idea here, more than anything, is that he prostrates himself, right? He uses something as a support in his prostrating. Yeah, exactly. There's a humbling image here, or maybe an ecstaticness almost, like this, he's an old man and he's just heard the good news that his son is going to do what he said he's going to do. And there's a worshipfulness, then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed or his staff. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. But I would imagine the primary reason the NIV would use staff there is because Hebrews uses staff, and so they're making a connection there. Good translation either way. So continuing on here, we're going to dip into chapter 48. This is more ground than we've covered in weeks. So after this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So after this could be 4.5 hours. It could be 6 weeks. It could be near the end of the famine. We don't know exactly. So it says, so he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, 'Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. And I will make of you a company of peoples and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession.'" So Jacob does what we assume Isaac did for Jacob and what we assume Abraham did for Isaac, that they recount the truth that God has revealed to them, the promise that's been made. Which tells us that this is an ancient tradition for the Israelite peoples, recounting the promises that God has made to them. They would be familiar with this language, although maybe Joseph isn't all that familiar. It's been, decades since he's last been with his father. And so his father reminds him of the promise. And the interesting thing is Joseph participates in the promise, but he also doesn't participate in the promise. And this has always been a peculiarity to me about the book of Genesis. Joseph is kind of living like 25 steps ahead of the rest of the Israelite people, all the sons of Jacob. He's the one who continually relies on God. Instead of taking credit for himself, he offers credit to God. He's the one who does the right thing at the right time. And he prospers tremendously. And I've thought a long and hard bit about why it is that we have two half-tribes and not just the tribe of Joseph. And here's what I'm going to say. I think that Joseph has received a promised land at this point in his life. I think Joseph has had promises fulfilled to him that were reserved for Joseph and Joseph alone. And this is part of that realization, perhaps, that at least for Joseph, much of the curse has been undone. Remember, Joseph was left for dead. And of all of his brothers, he is probably the most alive. Joseph was the one who was in the pit, in despair, who ultimately finds himself in a position of tremendous prosperity. Joseph doesn't have any real problems at this point in his life. He's even mended the relationships with his brothers, right? Whether or not they feel 100% good about what's happened, he's forgiven them. And he's content. And he's whole. Jacob doesn't have any blessing to give to Joseph because Joseph is already blessed, because Joseph has continually relied on God. A lesson that Jacob took decades of his life to learn, Joseph just sort of stumbled into naturally. But because Joseph doesn't receive a blessing, Jacob blesses his sons. And I want to focus on this blessing that's offered here. In verses 5 through 6 and then 9b through 10, it says, "And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are." Now notice who he chooses to compare them to. These two grandsons of the next to youngest son are compared to the two oldest sons. He says, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine, Ephraim and Manasseh are mine. And the children that you fathered after them, they'll be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age. Now this is, remember, maybe comeuppance for Jacob because his own father had dim eyes and he played a trick on him, right? Although here, with the dim eyes, he sees clearly enough to do something that the book of Genesis has been suggesting should have happened the whole time. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, or Jacob took them both. Joseph took them both. Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand. And he brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And let my name be carried on in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son. I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. Throughout the book of Genesis, it's always the second son. It's always the last in the line that ends up being the one that gets blessed. And the fathers have resisted that the entire time. Now, this might be Joseph's one failing, right? Because Jacob finally gets, it's not the way I would expect it to be. God works differently than how I would think he should work. And there's even that language that's used there. In the Hebrew, it's really evocative. It's like this pleading with him. Look, I know. But I also know something else. Every time that we've encountered someone trying to bless the first son, God has flipped it on its head. Abraham begs and pleads to be able to have Ishmael be the one that receives the blessing. God, let it be Ishmael. God says, no, he'll be a great nation as well, but I've chosen Isaac. Isaac mourns not being able to give Esau the proper blessing, and he says, you will be great nations as well. But God's chosen Jacob. And Isaac's thinking, I have no idea why. But Jacob here gets it. And twice in a single passage, he does the opposite of what you would expect. So here's the deal. Not only are these not his firstborn sons, they're not even his actual sons, they're his grandsons, and yet he places them in the position of his own firstborn sons. But he flips the two of them. And so Jacob inverts every possible expectation here. And this is going to play out for the rest of the history of Israel. In fact, when Israel is a divided kingdom into Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom that is Israel is not called by any of the sons of Jacob. It's called by the name Ephraim. That's the name that they're known by. Now, they're called the nation of Israel, but when God refers to them poetically in prophecy, they are Ephraim. And that's so backwards because that's not one of the sons of Jacob. And it's not even the oldest son of Jacob. It's so peculiar and strange. Why would you call the nation of Israel the name of the youngest possible heir of Jacob who's not even his own son? It's so peculiar. But then that tells us a lot about how God's expectations and our expectations often don't align. And it's this theme coming back around from the beginning of Genesis to this moment. And so now we'll leave it with this. It says in verse 20, so he blessed them that day, saying, by you, Israel, will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. This is a big question in the history of Israel. Why Ephraim and Manasseh? Well, because Jacob said so. May you be blessed as though you're the firstborn, even when you don't even belong to me. When you're the grandchild and not the firstborn. That's the message here in the story of Ephraim and Manasseh. And I've read it over and over again, and I never really understood until reading Genesis slowly how significant this moment is in communicating God's idea of who is significant to us. The people you would least expect. Now, Don's thinking, I don't know. I can see why I'd love my grandchildren a little more than I do my own kids. I love my kids a lot. My grandkids, though, my mom's told me this. She's like, when I had children, I thought I could never love anyone more. And then you gave me grandkids, and now that whole concept is blown out of the water. I'm like, thanks, Mom. I appreciate that. But the truth is, in ancient Israel, in the ancient world in general, You didn't give the grandkids the inheritance. You gave their father the inheritance. This is ridiculous, right? Like these are, first of all, we're told that these are young enough boys to sit on Joseph's knee. And Jacob is giving them a full share of the inheritance right up there with Reuben and Simeon. And that's pretty backwards. It's very strange, very peculiar. So I want to go ahead and wrap up for the evening. If you have questions or comments, maybe some dialogue this evening, that would be great. We covered a lot of ground, and we only have about 2.5 chapters left. We're steaming along. We're going to finish in time, so yeah. Questions or comments? Yes. Yeah.
Like Jacob showed Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just never have understood.
Yeah, it's strange, because in our culture, ideally we don't do that. I think, about the way that I love my children, right? And they're just so different from one another. There are things that I love so much about both of them that are unique to them as an individual, but I don't know that I love either of them more than the other one. Now, there are days where I tolerate one or the other of them more than the other, but I don't think I ever have more love for them. Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's very interesting because he does. Now, I don't know if he shows the favoritism towards Benjamin only as a test or because he genuinely does, like, hey, I know how hard it is to be the youngest brother in this group of knuckleheads. I love you. Here's my secret little gift to you, right? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's the amount of times that favoritism ends up being a really negative thing. I think there's a big message there, obviously. You think about the favorite wives in the book of Genesis and the hurt and heartache that it causes there. So there's 2 messages there. Don't marry more than one woman. But also, the significant people in your life, you're not called to play favorites with them. You're called to love them and to work in ways that you can uplift and encourage them. Your children are not tools or weapons to pit against one another or to say, well, this is the one I'm vesting my. Now, on the other hand, though, what we do see is that God does play favorites. I don't know if that's even the right word. God has a person he's chosen to work through, right? And actually, I'll say this. The wonderful thing about it is that Abraham thinks that only Isaac can be blessed, or only one of the sons can be blessed, which is why he sort of pleads for Ishmael, right? Well, let it be Ishmael. Isaac is good. No, let it be Ishmael. And God has enough blessing for both of them. God gives Ishmael a blessing. I'm going to make you a great nation, right? He ends up having 12 sons. There's this whole echo of what's going to happen with Jacob. Yeah. He knows very well who the right one to pick is, even if that right one isn't quite the right one yet. He knows who he's going to be able to help them become. Don.
Kind of dovetailing on that thought, and it's the Saul David thing too. God knows that the warrior king, the warrior leader,
Mm-hmm.
or the leader that everybody says, yeah, that should be the leader, he's going to really have a target on his back.
Yeah.
And you may not want to sick that on somebody.
Yeah.
In a way, it'd be nicer for the younger one. It doesn't have to say, I've got the blessing, I'm the boss, I'm leading everything. You may end up with a much better life. I
Mm-hmm.
think we're so programmed to say, power and money and fame is what it's about.
Yeah.
I mean, the 2 brothers, one becomes an NFL star,
Yeah.
and the other becomes a high school football coach.
The high school football coach probably has a lot less pressure on him. Yeah.
So I think sometimes we really get caught up in that.
Yep.
The guy who, in the world's eyes, advances higher,
Hmm.
isn't necessarily
Yeah. That's a pretty big theme in Genesis too, is that these guys that build all the cities, in our world, you're a city builder? That's fantastic. You must be a real ambitious sort of person. The book of Genesis, oh, you built a city. I know what they do in cities. I know the kind of people that are hanging out in the cities. I don't want to have anything to do with a city builder, right? It's maybe because Abraham doesn't have a whole lot of ambition that God calls him. The people that have big visions for themselves don't have enough room for God's vision for them. And Jacob is the perfect example of someone who's always looking to find a way to get himself what he wants. And one of the messages of the story of Jacob is like, I would have given it all to you, right? I've told you I would bless you, and you've just fought me the entire time. I'd give it to you. That's what I'm trying to do, and yet you wrestled me the whole way. And now I'm taking away the possibility of you doing it on your own accord. I'm going to give you a limp. I think that's a really good point, is that we sometimes think that it's, God giving you the title, the position, the place of power is the thing we all want. But the truth is, Jesus didn't really aspire to all those things. And Joseph absolutely did not aspire to any of it, right? Like look how I accidentally, the term failing up is the wrong one, because in our culture, you can fail upward. It's like, well, I just continually did the wrong thing, and look how I found myself in the right position. Joseph continually does the right thing in the worst possible circumstances, and as a result finds himself at the top of the heap. It's accidental achievement, right? I don't think there was ever a point in his life where he said, my plan for myself is to be the most powerful man in the world. He had dreams about it, visions, but it was his brothers that interpreted in those ways, right? He just told them the dreams. Good thoughts, Don.
two things that hit me coming from here. It's kind of where we are as a society now in the world. The neighboring people, and even the Egyptians themselves, don't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph says, I'm going to consolidate all your livestock first.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm going to consolidate all your land. And
Yeah.
You're going to be tenant farmers.
Yep.
You're tenement farmers. I'm installing communism.
Yeah. Yeah, right?
The state owns it all. Let you work
Yeah.
for the state.
Yep.
But everything's owned by the state. And when you think of the Ukraine right now,
Yeah.
the Ukraine knows what it was like to be under state-run
Yeah.
society. And there's still some people there that say, I think that was better.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people there
Yeah.
don't. But one big difference here, Joseph says 1/5 is going to go to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
You keep 4/5.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there might be, and I'm not a communist by any means.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everything.
The good news is you're not mic'd right now. So no.
But I think that sometimes God uses some different political economic systems
Mm-hmm.
for his purpose, and they can be done in a just way.
Yeah.
They usually, it's too much power for the state to hold, and they're usually not done
Yeah.
in a appropriate way.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I don't think the Bible is a book about economic structure.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
It is a book about justice.
Yeah.
And it's possible that what he's showing us here is exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a time for the state to take control,
Yeah.
but that's a dangerous thing.
Right. So one of the things that we see with Joseph is this idea of stewardship, right? Through the miraculous, God-ordained course of events, he finds himself in a position where he is entrusted with genuinely the fate of the world, right? Now, this is, as we tie up the book of Genesis, I'm going to say that's what Adam and Eve's initial role was. You are the priests to the rest of humanity in some way. You are intercessors between God and the world, right? He gives them dominion, and that means that they rule over the earth, but God rules over them. And that's kind of what happens with Joseph. I am Pharaoh, and I'm going to make you as powerful as me, everything except my own throne, essentially. And Joseph does that very well. He's a good steward. He provides for the worst possible scenario, right? He says, okay, we're going to have plenty, but we're gonna tighten our belts during that time of plenty so that it will last us through the time of famine. All right, we've come through the famine, and some of you were not good stewards even of what I gave you during that time. But you know what? The good news is I'm going to make sure that we have a reserve, right? By this, I'm going to take a fifth of everything that you have, because you should be able to keep, 4/5, and that's plenty for you to live on and eat and thrive and do really well. But there's going to be another famine someday. Someday, we're going to need a reserve, and you're going to be really grateful that I didn't give you 5/5 of what you had. And so the idea then also, if you take that and you extrapolate it forward to the law that God gives to the Israelite people, we look at the tithes and the offerings that they give, but we also forget that there are a whole bunch of provisions given for times of difficulty, right? Ways that they're going to care for the poor, the gleaning of fields, and those who take that seriously are keeping, I think, the spirit of God, but they probably are familiar with the story of Joseph. There's plenty to go around.
In that vein, too, this family was so severe. Times were so hard.
Yeah.
That people went along with it, and they were grateful to have period.
A good steward over them. Yeah.
Such a radical shift had occurred. And sometimes those kind of conditions get you in a position where you say, wow, we do need, if we stick with individuals,
Yeah.
we're going to have some serious warlord problems.
Yeah. Abimelech up in Canaan, he decided he's going to go get all the food, and then he's going to sell it back to you on terms that are less agreeable than Joseph's terms, right? That's the thing. This distribution process that he sets up works under someone like Joseph, who doesn't have, aspirations to even be in the position he's in. Doesn't work so well under someone like Esau, maybe, who has a lot of aspirations for his life. He would have been the wrong man for the position. Probably Judah be the wrong man for the position. Simeon, Reuben, they all have a little bit of ambition in their lives, which is why it hurts so bad that Dad thinks more highly of Joseph than us, right? Well, I could be as good as Joseph. Why does he get the coat that says that he's the steward of Dad's affairs or whatever? I think Robert had pointed that out, this idea that maybe the coat was a token of like his position within the household. There's a lot of little implication here about a good steward has no desire to better themselves because they trust that God is going to take care of them. And as God's taking care of them, they want to take care of others. Oh man, there's like a biblical principle there or something, right? He loved us first so that we might love others, that we might know what love is. So, it's a really good point, Don. I appreciate that.
Is there any point, I was thinking about this as we read it through this time too, we don't really know for sure if they ever told Jacob.
Yeah.
It was the brothers.
I had that thought. They come back and they tell him, hey, Dad, good news. Joseph is alive. We didn't actually kill him, and let it slip. Forget that last part we said. It seems as though.
Those brothers kept a secret for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And did that become common knowledge
Yeah.
If it were there, well, yeah, how'd Joseph get down here? Well, let's be transparent.
Yeah. Wait a second. You said he was torn to shreds by a wild animal. You brought me his coat. How did all of this happen? How did he make it to Egypt intact? Why are there no scars? He's a handsome-looking fella, like some ladies would be chasing after him, trying to grab his coat or something, right? Yeah, exactly. There's got to be some of those questions lingering, right? And the author of Genesis is kind enough to the brothers to just drop it, and maybe kind enough to Jacob, and what his reaction would have been.
They show your remorse.
Yeah.
And then later on, they're going to say, uh-oh, when
Yeah.
Jacob dies, is Joseph coming after us?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think there's a lot to be said for the themes that are going to kind of tie themselves together at the end of the book. And sometimes, we because Genesis is such a big book, we like to pull individual stories out, and here's the story of Abraham and Isaac. And that's good. It's a wonderful story, especially as it then maps on to, God and his son and the crucifixion and all of that. Beautiful, wonderful imagery there. But the book of Genesis as a whole is very coherent and cohesive. That's something I don't think it gets enough credit for. I'd say the whole Old Testament in many ways, the common themes from book to book to book, the threads that tie through history, that Genesis is telling you why Israel is called Ephraim. It's giving you language to understand God's prophecies or prophetic wisdom later on in the book in the right context. There's something to be said for just that slow ingesting of the Word of God that I think is beneficial. So, we're a few minutes over. I was going to be done on time, but you all had good comments and questions. So let's go ahead and wrap up with prayer and call it good for tonight. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the day you've given to us. We thank you for the blessing of your word. We thank you for ways in which we understand you better as a result of engaging Scripture on a regular basis. Father, we pray that we get our priorities not from our culture, not from the voices that are the loudest around us, but from you. That when people tell us to pick the first and put them at the top, we choose the last and we place them in the correct place. Help us to have little ambitions of our own, but great ambition to be shaped into your image. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.